in terms of funding paradigms from Western mission. There are 4 paradigms that I want to expose us to. The first is best known as presence. In the modern Western missions movement, the last 200 years, first missionaries were out there. That's what the presence idea means, is they left, they went to the trade centers in Africa, China, other parts of the world. There was very little communication back and forth. The funding paradigm just was essentially denominational. You were prepared as a preacher, generally, unless you went off on your own. You had your passage, and you survived in the field, in the trade centers, generally with a subsistence garden and very little support from your denomination. And then the missionaries started moving inland. In fact, they named their missions China Inland Mission, African Inland Mission. And what that meant was they left the trading posts where they sort of survived with the businesses that were in the trading centers, the Far East trading companies and other things like that. And they went off on their own. Hudson Taylor started dressing as a Chinese person and going in. David Livingstone was an explorer, actually, and a church planner, and was trying to bring down the Yao slave trade in Malawi. In fact, he's celebrated for that. Interestingly, at the end of his career, he was destitute, ill, and dependent on slave traders for his support. That's the presence era. They were out there. Hudson Taylor, when he started to communicate back, his periodicals were the celebrated reading of the day. They were read avidly because they were taking people into an exotic world, and they were showing them what God was doing out there. But the basic idea of that funding paradigm was presence. The missionaries out there somewhere. The second paradigm came along in the late 1800s in the U.S. through the student union, through the student missions movement, and then really took off after World War II with Campus Crusade and YWAM and all the great Western missions. But this one was, I like to characterize as activity. Not only were you out there, you were able to communicate back what you were doing. We're helping children. We're preaching the gospel. We're teaching Bible school. There was this sense of activity. In that generation, support was in that Hudson Taylor model as he got it going. It was an expected thing that you joined a mission and stayed with that mission through your whole career. And you were supported through your whole career and into your retirement. This is the way the economy in the United States worked. You came out of college, you went to work for one company. You stayed with that company until you got your pension. Mission support was the exact same way. There was an expectation that you were going to stay with the mission, and as long as you were active, that's all that was really required of you. I mean, I'm making big, broad generalizations here, but the funding model was based on the activity and the presence. One of the key features of this support model were mission Sundays, mission weekends, the Lottie Moon offering, and other things like that. Another key feature was in the foyer of every evangelical church was a world map and a push pin and a piece of yarn from the push pin to a postcard of a smiling family. And that was our family, and they were in Papua, or they were in Senegal, or depending on the size of your budget and your church, you might have a whole bunch of those postcards, or you may just have a few. And then every 3 years, that missionary would come through your church. They'd wear the native garb. You might eat some funny curry food, and you had a missions weekend. And if the pastor was real gregarious, he may even let you preach. You stayed in people's homes. Mostly it was about the connection, the personal connection, the activity, and that you were out there. Then in the mid-90s, the third era of Western funding paradigms. So I'm giving you a limited picture of Western funding paradigms. In the mid-90s, the third era slammed into this activity era. And that was the outcomes era. Baby boomers, this huge bulge in the population in the United States of post-World War II babies, and of the great American expansion of wealth and suburbs and all that. All those babies were now in power. They were in the pulpits, they were in the missions committees, and they were the supporters in businesses. And they were completely different than what was known as the Great Generation, this generation whose bywords were loyalty, steadfastness, stick with it, all those phrases, long suffering, all that stuff described that generation and why they stayed with a missionary through life. The baby boom generation, almost the exact opposite. Short-term horizons. A baby boomer expected to change jobs. It was the baby boomer generation in the United States that got rid of the pension system and went to the 401k system, because your pension had to travel with you, because you were moving. Well, when these people started taking over missions committees, they started asking a new question. And the question was, what's happening because of this activity? What's changing? What are you accomplishing? It was a good question. It got asked wrong. Somebody asked me about jerk donors. There's a lot of them. This is one of the areas where they started demanding these outcomes. In fact, we're going to get into something called the Lausanne Standards a little later. And that came out of, it was a result of this right here, this outcomes-based idea of missions, that you could somehow judge the effectiveness of the missions through results and numbers. Led to things like donors asking, how many baptisms per dollar am I getting for my gift? Am I making that up, Tom? Has anyone ever been asked that one? Let me see a show of hands. Anybody been asked that one? Seriously, look around the room. People literally thought they could apply a business model to a faith outcome. All three of these eras are still at play. I mean, you don't lose one to go to the next. They all stay in play. Missionaries started getting fired from churches all over the United States in the mid-90s. It slammed into the faith mission movement big time. There isn't a single mission that didn't have to deal with the fallout of that paradigm of outcomes. People started asking, why are we giving Chris $50? Who is Chris? I mean, they'd literally, that would be the question at the missions meeting. And the person that had sponsored Chris might be an 80-year-old woman who, who knew him 30 years ago or 20 years ago or something, and wasn't at the meeting, and they'd send a letter. Dear Chris, be blessed and be gone. How many of you got those letters? I bet you a few of you did. Yeah. I rest my case. You have one among you. We thought everything could be judged out by numbers. This outcomes thing sort of got us all caught up in it. It got so bad that a heresy actually started growing out of it, that somehow, if you had enough outcomes, you could return Christ. You preach the gospel everywhere, and he's got no choice, he's got to show up. Like a vending machine. Put in your buck, get your water bottle. Jesus got to come back. We just got through preaching out in some place that the gospel never had done, and that was the last one. I was in meetings at the Billy Graham itinerant evangelist thing where they literally stood up and said that. There's 1,893 unreached people groups. How many are you going to take? 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 And if they could get all 1,893 done, it was done. The job was done. Not what was the content of the preaching, what did the churches look like, who's there, what have you done. It was American exceptionalism. It was the prosperity gospel in another way. And it all came out of this one. But there was truth in it. Really, what was getting done? Did you actually have a plan? Were there some results? I mean, there was a corrective nature to this as well. So it wasn't just a black and white thing. It also had to do with, Tom and I had some of the first jobs in evangelical foundations. Before us, when we started out in our work in '83, me on the West Coast, Tom in Tennessee, there were about 4 or 5 people that we knew that were doing our job. And the first meetings we had together, 5, 6 people. Now there's hundreds and all sorts of institutional givers. And most of them have this as their paradigm of giving. But what we're concerned with here is not so much this, but I can go into more of this, but it's this fourth era. It's come on us like a wave. And you guys are the principal indicator of that era. This one I call ownership and engagement. These first three were enormously successful. How many people, not from the West, can trace their church heritage to the West in this room? What I mean by that is, did the church in your country get planted by a Western missionary in the last 200 years? Almost everybody. So they were very successful. In fact, I've got a full-time career now as a coach and a consultant working for First Fruit with missions, helping them deal with their success. They think of it as a problem. I see it as success. The church now is in its second and third generation and beyond in many of these places. This is the ownership and engagement paradigm. You're ready to own your own institutions, and you're ready to engage as equals with the West. This is no more you're the receiver and they're the sender. The West is having a really hard time dealing with this. But the majority world is the majority world now. And so what we're going to be dealing with from here on out in the next 2.5 days is the implications of ownership and engagement. This means you, non-Western leader, must take responsibility for your own work. It's time. The role of the West is to be engaged with you as an equal, somehow as a partner, and it has to be defined. And not one of us has this defined right yet, because this is new. It's like a wave that's coming on us. It's come as fast as the outcome one did, and it is catching everybody off guard. And that, we were experiencing it as grant makers working in missions before the book, The Next Christendom, came out. We used to talk, we had meetings talking about it, 8, 10 years before that book came out, about the implications of the church being strong and growing and on its own, in effect, but still some of the institutions very dependent on the West. The phrase in Latin America was, we look to the north from whence our help comes. Is that right? Well, that's all changed. That's what this conference is all about, is because it's all changed. Ownership in this, what I'm describing here, is you and your church and your missions. You own that mission. By that, and let me understand, ownership is a loose term. It's being responsible for your mission. It's being responsible for your church, not the West is responsible and you're merely employees or some quasi-partner, some sort of underdog and they're the overdog, or they've got the money and you don't have the money. What we're talking about here is the majority world church taking ownership of its own institutions and engaging with each other and with the West as equals. It's a new paradigm.